Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the United States Army brass being on drugs. Since the 1960s, the US military and much of NATO has been using the 5.56 or 5.56 by 45 millimeter. In this case, this is M193 ball, which is a 55 grain bullet doing a little over 3,000 feet per second. Now the bullet at close range, inside 300 yards, which it's kind of really relegated to that range to be fully effective. The cartridge does do damage to tissue, but it's not ideal. It's not a cartridge that's well suited for barrier penetration and things like that, or shooting past 300 yards. Now, when the cartridge was developed and the type of warfare that the United States was involved in the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia, the cartridge made sense. It was lighter weight, you could carry more ammunition on the soldier, and it was controllable on full auto fire, and it was well suited to the fighting in the confines of a dense jungle. Fast forward, and we get into the War on Terror, and the 5.56 once again in the urban environment was doing pretty well, but where it started to run into problems is when you got out into the non-urban environment of the desert area, where you're taking shots past 300 yards. The 5.56 really started to fall flat on its face, and this caused the US military to start looking at other options. And one of those options was the 6.8 SPC. And we're going to talk about that in this video, but we also want to talk about the 6.8 by 51. Now the 6.8 SPC is a 6.8 bullet, 277 caliber, by 45. It's the same length as the 5.56 and fits in a rifle much like this 6940. But the new 227 Fury / 6.8 by 51 is the same length as a 308 cartridge, but it shoots a neck down 6.8 bullet at higher velocity. But does it make much sense? And let's talk about that in this video. Now, this 6940 probably represents the ultimate evolution of the M4 carbine, in my opinion. It has its monolithic rail out here. It still runs direct gas impingement, and it's a very smooth shooting rifle. You can shoot it very quickly, very accurately, and it's just a nice overall gun. But there were some pretty cool options that were developed for basically updating this and giving it more power through the 6.8 SPC. Very low recoil, very nice to shoot, but less than ideal. Over the years, you guys have seen me use a lot of primary arms optics, everything from red dot sights to magnified optics. And why do I do that? Well, over the years, they've offered very good products for a very fair price. They have fast shipping, outstanding customer support, and that's why you've seen me using those products for so many years. If you guys would like to pick up a magnified optic like you see on this Daniel Defense Mark 12, you can pick up an optic like this one. Just put it in your cart over at pa.com or primaryarms.com, and if you use the code MAC at checkout, MAC at checkout, you'll get a free scope mount with your optic, and that goes for any Primary Arms branded optic. If you pick up an optic that has an integrated mount, use that code MAC at checkout, and you'll get a free Kill Flash ARD for that optic. So please swing by and check out primaryarms.com. So in the early 2000s, the US Army, as it does oftentimes, decided to go out and look at a way to replace or improve the performance of the M16, M4, A4 rifle systems that it had in inventory. And so they were taking a look at increasing the power but maintaining the exact same form factor of the original M16. And that's where the 6.8 SPC comes in. The rifle that I have here is a Rec 7. It's an early Gen 1 gun, but it looks very similar to what Barrett would submit to the US Army for testing the 6.8 SPC, which was known as the M468 rifle. Now again, this is an early Gen 1 Rec 7, which is a variation of that. The original gun, the original M468, was a direct gas impingement rifle. This later evolution of that gun has a short stroke gas piston in it. Has a very similar arms rail out here. It's threaded for an over-the-barrel type suppressor, and it has arms flip up rear sight here and a flip up sight in the front. But again, this is a short stroke gas piston gun, which makes it very much different than the M468 that the US Army was trying, but it looks very similar overall. Again, they were just trying to increase the performance without changing the basic core rifle. So the manual of arms would be the same, most everything would be the same with the exception of a few small parts. If you take a look at the 6.8 SPC, I have one here with my finger on the tip of a 6.8 SPC. And then here is a M193 ball round. This is a 55 grain bullet. This is a 115 grain bullet in the 6.8 SPC. If you take a look at the ballistics of the 6.8, it's operating at about 58,700 PSI. It's pushing that 115 grain bullet at 2,550 feet per second-ish, which is generating 1,694 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Contrast that to the 5.56 with its 55 grain bullet, which is operating in the 55,000 PSI range. The 55 grain bullet is going to do a little over 3,200 feet per second out of a 20-inch barrel. You shorten the barrel, that velocity goes down, and so does the effectiveness of the 5.56. But that's going to give you a foot-pound of foot-pounds of energy right in the 1,251 arena. So 1,251 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Now there are different versions of the ball round that is used by the M16, right? So the M193 would be the 55 grain. Then we have the M855, M855A1. But if you take a look at the M855, it's a 62 grain bullet, and that's generating about 1,325 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So the 6.8 definitely has a leg up, especially at the muzzle, over the 5.56. It's significantly more powerful. And that seemed like a pretty good idea. Again, all you really have to do is change the bolt and the barrel of a standard M4 rifle, let's say, and the magazine, and now you're running 6.8 out of your existing inventory of M4s. So it seemed to make a whole lot of sense, but it went nowhere. The 6.8 SPC was dropped by the US military. The M468 died. Barrett tried to keep it alive with the Rec 7. This is a Gen 1 Rec 7 later. Current generation Rec 7s look more like your standard AR-15 with an M-LOK rail system on it. But it just kind of faded away. 6.8 got picked up by hunters. It's great for pig hunting down in Texas. I've used it for deer hunting, things like that, because it definitely increases the power out of the AR-15 type rifle without increasing the size of it. You're not going to an AR-10 sized rifle, and you're maintaining the same lightweight and low recoil impulse. This thing is very controllable with the 6.8 cartridge. Now the US military is taking a look at another cartridge, and this is 2022 of this recording, and that's what we want to talk about next, because this is where I think the Army possibly is doing drugs. Now, before we go any further in this video, I want to say I've never fired the 6.8 by 51. I want to. I desperately want to get my hands on one. Sig has released the SPEAR rifle, which looks to be very similar to the Virtus rifle, just upsized to be able to handle the larger cartridge. Those things actually went up for sale recently, at least a handful of them, and they were selling for an astronomical amount, like $10,000. So they're starting to produce the rifles. They're starting to sell the rifles, it would seem, at least on the civilian market. Good luck finding the ammunition. I've not found any for sale anywhere. But maybe that will change. It depends, because you never know with cartridges like this. Now with the 6.8, it died in the military trials, but it lived on as a civilian cartridge. Whether or not the 6.8 by 51 will live on as a civilian cartridge is yet to be determined. Now, talking about the 6.8 by 51 in a general purpose machine gun, which was what it was originally intended for, it makes more sense. It's a heavier gun. We're extending the range and lethality of the general purpose machine gun, and because of that extra weight and size, it does make somewhat sense. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you take a look at 308 as a whole. Other cartridges or other loads are available for the 308. Now, I understand that the higher velocity, the higher BC that the 6.8 has does give it an advantage over the 308 at really extended ranges. But let's take a look at some of the ballistics data that we have available on the internet for the 277 Fury / 6.8 by 51. So it has that case that operates at 80,000 PSI. It has a bullet availability of 130 grain or 140 grain. The 140 grain load seems to be the most powerful of the two, and it's pushing that 6.8 bullet at 3,000 feet per second, which gives it 2,798 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So that's a lot of muzzle energy. Where does the 308 stack up in that? Well, if you take a look at the original 147 grain ball load, it falls short of that expectation. But if you look at heavier bullets, heavier loads that are available out there for the 308, like the 175 grain match round here from Federal. This is a 175 grain load. And especially if you take a look at the new 185 grain, make sure I got the right box, load from Federal, which we've just started to play with, which is actually an amazing load for the 308, where do these two cartridges stack up in the power spectrum to this 277 Fury? Well, if you take a look at the 175 grain Sierra bullet that they're loading into their match ammunition, it's giving us 2,627 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, as compared to 2,798 of the 6.8 by 51. If we step it up to the 185 grain bullet, that's giving us 2,777 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, contrasting that against 2,798 foot-pounds of muzzle energy on the 277 Fury. The 308 is still capable of keeping up and not operating at those insanely high pressures. And why is that detrimental, perhaps, to the 6.8 by 51's adoption on the civilian market? 308's widely available, and generally speaking, when the markets are favorable, very affordable. I can't see under any circumstances, at least in my lifetime, where a cartridge that is constructed from 3 different components, not counting the bullet itself, a mixture of steel and brass, is going to be competitive price-wise to the standard old punch brass of a 308 cartridge. That has to drive the cost of that cartridge up, especially for early adopters. I would imagine you're going to be paying at least $2 a round, if not more, if you do adopt the 6.8 by 51 when it does finally become available on the civilian market. Now, on the military side, in a rifle, if you take a look at Task and Purpose, their website, their YouTube channel, they've actually been able to handle the Spear rifle and the new Raptor rifle, which is a shorter carbine. And the rifle seems to handle the recoil a bit better, more like an FAL or a G3. But that little Raptor, which is a short-barreled carbine on full auto, is a little monster. Now, why would we want to do something like that? It seems, again, that we're going back in history. If you go back to World War I, rifles of that era would have sights that would increment out to 1,000, sometimes even 2,000 meters. Very optimistic if you're going to hit something at that distance. And so we went away from that because we learned in World War I, by the time we got to World War II, that most engagements happened at much closer ranges, inside 300 yards. That's why we adopted the 5.56. But in some engagements, like in Afghanistan, it can go past 300 yards. So we're coming full circle here. It looks like we're trying to go backwards in time and increase the range of our infantry rifles. But we're also increasing the recoil impulse. We're going back to the G3s and the FALs. They're not going to be controllable for the average troop on full auto. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It would make more sense if the military went back and looked at the 6.8 SPC for their infantry rifles and leave the 6.8 by 51 to the general purpose machine guns. So now, let me show you again. I haven't fired the Raptor or the Spear, but what I can do is show you what the 6.8 SPC looks like out of a standard M4 style rifle. This is the Rec 7, very similar, but gas piston driven is to the original M468. As you can see, while the recoil is just a little bit more than 5.56, it's by no means uncontrollable. That little Raptor shooting that 6.8 by 51 definitely looks uncontrollable. Also keep in mind, when you're pushing a heavy bullet that's 140 grains at 3,000 feet per second, you're going to eat up barrels pretty quickly. So if you're firing those things on full auto or in combat environments where you're doing mag dumps, the barrels on that 277 Fury are going to get eaten up pretty quickly. Now, I would imagine SIG maintains its quick change barrel capabilities, and if they do adopt that cartridge, I can see the machine guns and even the infantry rifles eating those barrels up fairly quickly. So in the end, I'm very interested in playing with the 6.8 by 51 and think it's going to be interesting to have a new cartridge. I always love innovation and new things, but how practical it's going to be in use in terms of military use, I guess that's yet to be seen. All we can do is speculate, but it certainly seems to me that they're spending a whole lot of time and money for something that potentially isn't going to give them exactly what the U.S. military needs, especially in terms of an infantry rifle, if that's the direction they're thinking. So, I don't know. It's kind of like the U.S. military has this long-standing history of spending millions and millions, maybe even billions of tax dollars trying to develop new weapon systems that they ultimately don't do anything with, and they get wound up, left in the dustbin of history. Guys, if you enjoy the content that we produce here at the Military Arms Channel, please consider becoming part of our Patreon family. You'll get early access to videos like this one. I answer all private communications. Link in the video description below. Also, right here on YouTube, you got a little join button underneath the video player you're watching right now. Mash that join button, and you can support us here on YouTube in the age of demonetization. And last but not least, please swing by and check out coppercustom.com. Thank you for 14 years of support, and I'll talk to you guys soon.